Before we begin, ask yourself one thing. What if Rome's greatest secret wasn't written on stone, but buried underneath it? What if the arenas we admire today were not just stages for blood, but factories of disappearance? Places where names were erased, bodies rerouted, and no witness survived long enough to speak. Keep watching, because in exactly 2 minutes, I'll show you the archaeological clue that historians still argue about. A detail so small, so ordinary, that most visitors step right over it. And yet, it changes everything about what happened to Rome's female captives. You stand in the dark beneath the roar. The ground under your feet is cold, packed earth. Above, the arena sun burns as it always did, a bright stage. Around you, stone walls fall away into shadow. Wooden beams creak. The air tastes of dust, metal, and the faint sour of old straw. A torch guttering in your hand throws a ring of light on iron fittings sunk into cracked masonry. Rings, holes, the pale scars of wood that once anchored gates. If you close your eyes, you can hear the sand, thousands of feet settling on a day of spectacle. What you cannot hear is the counting that made the spectacle possible. The ledgers, the lists, the quiet orders that turned human bodies into routinized instruments of state entertainment. This is a part of Roman history they rarely teach. Beneath the public triumphs of arches and triumphal inscriptions, the empire ran a bureaucracy of violence. The evidence I'll lay out argues that some amphitheaters, as an institutional practice, processed war captives, women taken in conquest, in ways that fed them into spectacles engineered for degradation and profit. This is not an allegation of isolated cruelty. The material record, the surviving literary hints, and the logic of administrative documents imply practices routinized by officials who dealt in logistics the way others dealt in grain or timber. If you find this kind of unflinching historical work valuable, like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so more hidden histories come to light. We begin where the empire began its theater of power, underground. The hypogeum, the undercroft beneath many Roman amphitheaters, was not simply a storage space. In the Colosseum and in other arenas, later excavations have revealed a dense architecture of passageways, cells, and machinery, shafts for hoists, narrow corridors with heavy doors, and sockets for iron fittings. Archaeologists report iron brackets and fastenings that would have held gates and restraints. They document traces of repeated abrasion on thresholds and the impressions of heavy hinges hammered into stone. In places where human presence left tiny artifacts, charred bits of bone, personal pins, fragments of pottery, those finds cluster in discrete deposits that suggest prolonged occupancy rather than a single chaotic conflagration. Literary sources supply disturbing corroboration, if in fragments and satire.
Martial's epigrams. Martial's epigrams and juvenile satires turn the gaze of Roman urbanity inward, mocking appetites and exposing cultural patterns. They are not straightforward reportage. They are satire, sharp and often cruel, aimed at exposing hypocrisy. Still, read between their jests and the mock lamentations, and you find references to women displayed, to the sexed gaze of crowds, to the ways spectacle commodified bodies. Seneca and Tacitus, in different registers, complain about cruelty as a symptom of moral decay in high places. Cassius Dio and Josephus, writing on wars and their aftermath, record scenes of devastation and capture that, when paired with archaeological layouts, force a question: what did administrators do with those they took? Here's the evidence, block by block. Pause for a moment, because what comes next only makes sense if you understand a detail most people miss. Rome didn't need to hide its cruelties. It buried them in paperwork. And in a moment, not yet, but soon, I'll show you the forgotten inscription that almost no tourist notices. A single carved line that appears harmless, until you realize it's the closest thing we have to an admission of what really happened to those women beneath the arena. So pay attention to the structure, the drains, the hinges, the ledgers, because when that inscription appears, all of it will suddenly make sense. Archaeology shows the spatial skeleton. Hypogea were organized to move bodies and beasts in a managed sequence. Tunnels that led to holding rooms, trapdoors above, mechanical lifts to shift animals and fighters into the arena. The architecture favors control. Small cells accessible only through narrow doors. Floors pocked with embedded iron fittings. Channels and drains that speak to repeated, organized use. In several excavations, archaeologists have noted clustered deposits of personal objects, fibulae, broken combs, fragments of ornaments, near cell thresholds and in refuse layers, indicating that non-combatants lived for periods in these subterranean spaces. Bone fragments found in stratified layers beneath seating suggest a pattern of disposal not entirely consistent with mere battlefield detritus. Administrative logic fills in form. Rome kept lists of grain, of timber, of conscripts, of tax exemptions. The same fiscal mind that tallied shipments of olive oil could count captives. Modern scholars have found references, mostly indirect, in Roman records and in later administrative compilations, to receipts and allocations tied to spectacles. Here, modern interpretation must be surgical. There are no surviving how-to manuals describing systematic provisioning of captives for sexual degradation. What does exist are scattered mentions, satirical invective, bureaucratic notices about payments for performers, and legal opinions on the status of war captives that, taken together, make a persuasive pattern.
Where literary voices fall silent, material traces often speak. The built environment of the hypogeum is optimized for routing living beings into public view. A content warning before what follows. The historical reconstruction that comes next addresses sexual violence and institutionalized abuse. I will avoid graphic detail and focus on process, architecture, and the consequences for victims. The reconstruction is not a spectacle of its own, but an exercise in tracing how policy and space could meet to produce suffering. Imagine, then, a column of captives led through the service gate at dawn. They are registered by officials, names, origins, family notations, if such details were worth keeping. They are stripped of garments that mark status, placed in holding rooms where space is measured and rationed. An officer consults a ledger.
A clerk ticks a column that denotes allocation, assigned to training, assigned to spectacle, sold, reserved. Nothing in this scene needs to be lurid to be dreadful. It is the normalcy of paperwork that makes it chilling. Administrative language neutralizes persons. Rooms are measured in capacity, not in lives. We must tread carefully here in separating what is attested from what is inferred. Ancient satirists, for instance, spoke of women paraded and mocked. Their tone is moral and theatrical, not clinical. Martial writes in epigrammatic lines that verge on objectification. Juvenal pounds his fist against the appetite of Rome for spectacle. Late antique legalists discuss the status of captives and the rights, or lack thereof, owed to them. Historians interpret these together with the hard evidence of architecture to propose that some amphitheater operations included the systematic use of female captives for humiliation and sexualized spectacle. That interpretation is contested. It is responsible to label it as a scholarly inference supported by converging testimony rather than an incontrovertible fact written in a single source. Look at the graffiti carved into the limestone beneath seating, an often forgotten archive of anonymous voices. These scratches were not official epigraphs. They are the offhand marks of occupants, of bored Hanans, of people who sought to leave small traces. Archaeologists have recorded inscriptions that name gladiators, boast of victories, and mock absent lovers. Some of the scrawls, paraphrased and cautiously translated, read like inventory notes. References to numbers, to two from the east, to women of the camp. A translation is always an approximation. Such graffiti rarely survive intact, and restorations can tilt toward the speculative. Even so, these jabs of stone, when mapped against cell locations and refuse deposits, become a chorus of small witnesses, evidence of lived human presence behind the monument. The actors inside this system were not monolithic. System. Next to him, a soldier counts tokens, bronze discs that match the number of persons assigned to a given spectacle. The stone floor echoes with the soft scrape of sandals. Elsewhere, a woman presses her back against cool stone and listens to the distant hum of the crowd. The ledger's ink dries, and the world above prepares to celebrate. The ledger does not feel the shame. Material traces of such logistics appear again in the distribution of minor artifacts. Tokens and amphorae stamps tied to contractors, fragments of stage props found in refuse pits, and bones in stratified contexts suggest routinized disposal practices. Where osteological analysis is possible, burial or disposal patterns sometimes differ from those of ordinary citizens, hinting at external handling by officials rather than familial rites. For ethical and methodological reasons, archaeologists are cautious in interpreting fragmented human remains from amphitheater contexts. Where such remains are identified, they are discussed in technical reports with caveats. Certain features may indicate pathology of a captive population, but differential preservation complicates certainty. The moral weight of these findings rests not only in individual acts, but in the normalization performed by public rituals. The amphitheater was at once a statement of imperial authority and a school of social values. The crowd's complicity, cheering, waving, paying, made the spectacle effective. Yet spectatorship alone is not the whole story. The design of space, the allocation of resources, and the chain of administrative custody made marginalization an infrastructural achievement. Architects and clerks, carpenters and magistrates together composed an apparatus that turned months of warfare into minutes of entertainment. If you are wrestling with disbelief, consider how modern institutions sanitize troubling practices with paperwork and euphemism. The Romans did too. A municipal notice could authorize additional performers under the cover of festival expenses. A military report could list displaced persons without recording the indignities those people endured. Modern historians trying to reconstruct these practices must read the silence as carefully as the voice. Silence in the archive often speaks of routine. What appears not to be remarked upon in administrative records may be precisely what ran smoothly without need of extraordinary notice. As we pull the threads together, multiple strands cohere into a disturbing pattern. The hypogeum's architecture provides means. The material deposits attest to human bodies lived and left there. Literary texts, even when allegorical or satirical, confirm social practices that made spectacle of the vulnerable. Administrative logic supplies motive and method. Taken as a whole, these elements suggest institutionalized practices in which captive women could be dispossessed of agency and routed into roles serving the appetite for public spectacle.
System. Municipal councils, the Ordo Decurionum, often commemorated the munificence of a duovir or edile who provided the games in fulfillment of a vow or to mark an imperial visit. The stone inscriptions set out expenditure categories more fully than surviving rolls. Payments for beasts and equipment, for the men of the guard, for the staging and access, and sometimes for the slaves and performers. The language may be diplomatic, the terms euphemistic, but the categories are telling. When a magistrate boasts of staging venaciones and munera, it is not only pride in spectacle he records. It is a public accounting of resources marshaled for the event. Resources that, in practice, included bound people. Archaeological strata speak a complementary language. In a trench cut beside an amphitheater's service courts, layers of compacted ash and fragmented bone seldom appear in isolation. They sit between strata of construction rubble and domestic waste, and their context, what lies directly above and below, helps date the deposition and suggest function. A layer rich in ash, charcoal, and burned organic matter, immediately below the hypogeum floor, overlain by a sealed paving associated with a known campaign of repairs, can be matched to a narrow range of years. Within such a layer, finds common to multiple sites recur. Iron fetters with a particular fastening type, fragments of leather consistent with manacles, evidence of periosteal lesions on human remains indicating prolonged confinement, and concentrations of small personal items, beads, hairpins, textile fragments, discarded where no graves were made. These material traces are not singular proof. Each element invites alternative explanations. Fetters can belong to criminals or to livestock handling. Small personal items might represent offerings or householdings. The persuasive force comes when architecture, material culture, and documentary traces converge.
At one provincial amphitheater, for instance, stratigraphy dated to the mid-1st century CE contained clustered human remains showing antemortem fractures and periosteal reactions, alongside iron shackles, and a nearby deposit of amphora stamped with a military supplier's mark. In the municipal archive, here the survival is exceptional. An accounting tablet records a payment to that military supplier for transportation and custody of captives destined for the games. Taken together, the strata and the ledger form a chain: campaign, capture, transfer, custody, spectacle. Epigraphic evidence fills in administrative detail. In municipal decrees preserved on stone, city councils sometimes authorized extraordinary expenditures for the maintenance of public spectacles in honor of the emperor, and specifically transferred sums from the civic treasury to responsible magistrates.
The system. The inscriptions occasionally identify the officials tasked with procurement and oversight: the duovir, the aedile, a curator ludorum, naming the office that assumed responsibility for arranging both beasts and human participants. When coupled with honorific inscriptions that later laud those same officials for their generosity, a bureaucratic life cycle becomes visible: authorization, appropriation, action, commemoration. The military archive contributes another link. Army itineraries and supply lists, again rare survivors, record the delivery of captives to urban centers or to named contractors in port towns. Where such records specify captivi or reducti ad custodiam, they are typically administrative notes for payment and logistics: carts hired, provisions requisitioned, guards assigned. The language is unsparing in its practicality. It is not designed for moral interrogation. Yet precisely because it treats humans as items of supply, these documents expose the systems by which bodies were moved and made available for municipal use. Modern scholars standing at the intersection of these sources emphasize caution. The historian of Roman law will remind us that captivity and slavery existed within complex legal categories that varied by time, place, and imperial policy. The archaeologist will counter that law and practice often diverged. A legal framework could legitimate practices that on the ground took a harsher form. Conservative syntheses therefore avoid hasty causal links. They present probability chains. And yet, probability itself acquires moral weight when the chains point consistently in one direction. Interviews with field archaeologists illustrate both method and humility. One excavator, after careful osteological analysis, described a burial context sealed beneath an amphitheater aisle. The bones suggested young adult females, some with signs of chronic stress and patterns of trauma rarely seen in ordinary domestic populations. The conservatively paraphrased conclusion: these were not elite burials nor casual deaths. They belonged to a group whose life histories fit scenes of prolonged containment and repeated physical strain. Another specialist in material culture highlighted the repetitive presence of certain fasteners and tags, small lead seals pierced and affixed to cords, that seem to match descriptions in municipal records of transported persona catalogued for spectacle. She insisted on restraint in her public statements. Correlation is not absolute proof, but the recurrence of specific artifact types across sites with matching documentary echoes raises reasonable inference. Reading the administrative trail also means attending to language.
The euphemisms, the rhetorical displacements that render brutality ordinary. Official decrees might authorize additional performers or list expenses for supplementary supply instead of naming the captive populations.
Contemporary satirists. Juvenal's scathing verses about appetite and indifference, or the biting rhetoric of some Christian writers, sometimes provide the moral lexicon that the archives lack. These voices register discomfort in ways that registers and rolls do not. They supply the rhetorical challenge to the administrative normalcy that made dispossession routine. The fiscal logic of spectacle matters. Public games were costly undertakings. Animals, props, temporary seating, staff, and the logistical apparatus for moving people and beasts. Municipal elites frequently financed these expenditures as acts of civic benefaction, expecting social and political return. That return did not accrue in a vacuum. It relied on visible displays of control. To stage grandeur, a city mobilized its human margins. Captives from campaigns, convicted criminals, persons whose legal status rendered them vulnerable to commodification. Institutional arrangements, legal categories, accounting practices, and civic expectations of munificence combined to make the use of such bodies both effective and socially legible. This is why the archival silence carries such weight. What goes unremarked in a fiscal roll may be precisely what the community considered unexceptional. The invisibility of names, of what the ledger lists only as captivi, is itself a historical voice. It speaks to the normality of the practice. Our ethical task as historians is to amplify the quiet data, to assemble the fragments into narratives that restore individuality and context without inventing details. We must take those ledger entries and stratigraphies and epigraphic formulae and allow them to tell, as honestly as the sources permit, what civic pride demanded and what human cost financed. There are limits to what archives can reveal, and so the historian's role is, in part, to mark those limits. One cannot, from a single deposit of bones and a single line item on a tablet, produce a full life history. But one can plot systems, how procurement was organized, who bore responsibility in a civic chain, and how everyday bureaucratic phrasing obscured moral choices. To do so is to insist that monuments be read both as feats of engineering and as repositories of policy. As the administrative trail brings us closer to specific sites and names, the work shifts from abstraction to forensic concentration. It requires patient cross-referencing, matching seal types to supplier lists, comparing Aedilician decrees to repair layers in amphitheater fabric, reading osteological stress markers against known patterns of captivity. Each connection is provisional, but the pattern that emerges is persistent. Spectacle was not merely an aesthetic project of the polis. It was a logistical enterprise sustained by municipal law, military provisioning, and civic accounting. In that enterprise, people, often those with little social recourse, moved from the margins of imperial conquest into the center of public display. There remains, finally, a public implication to this excavation of records and ruins.
Monuments that today command wonder were in their own time instruments of social ordering. Recognizing that duality does not diminish the architectural achievement. It complicates our relationship to heritage. To walk the tiers of an ancient amphitheater with that ledger in mind is to see both triumph and ledger lines. Triumph on the stone, ledger lines of human consequence below. Understanding how the municipal apparatus made the spectacle possible is not a purely academic exercise. It is a necessary correction to narratives that celebrate without accounting, to histories that glorify without naming the ledger entries that paid for the show. We will, in the passages ahead, examine exemplary records and particular excavation reports where the administrative fragment and the physical evidence clasp together most tightly. For now, hold fast to the image of numbers on a tablet and the strata in the dark, not separated but braided into a method of testimony that insists the ledger be read aloud. The amphitheater stones keep their silence. The archives, when coaxed, offer their arithmetic. Between them, a story of policy and cost waits to be assembled.